Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and as always, I'm here with Paul. And Paul, in light of the last week's meeting between President Trump and uh, in Riyadh with Russia and the German elections, we seem to have a disconnect that's taking place where the U.S. is pulling out of its support of Ukraine and Europe is having to stand up and do it by itself. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion and definitely want to get your thoughts on this because it looks like the European leaders are going hog wild to want to keep the war going indefinitely.
Well, first off, thanks, Ken, for joining me as well. It's always a pleasure when we get together. Well, the important point with this is there's a number of things to break this down. It relates to the ongoing war. It relates to when the war's over and what happens in terms of the role of Europe or otherwise in a post Ukraine war environment for both Ukraine and obviously Russia as part of the US-Russia agreement. There's also all this idiotic statements regarding the future defense of Europe or NATO countries as well. So there's an awful lot of things that all hang together. They're all relevant. And really, it basically does come back to the point of the title of this is, what happens if Europe tries to go it alone with Ukraine? Now, unfortunately, I think some of the understanding of that has got a bit out of kilter with reality because whilst Trump's talking, obviously, and the Russians, hopefully soon, they're going to start more bilateral talk. I think it'll be probably a couple of months before they start getting into the Ukraine stuff. So the war's not going to end imminently because Russia's made the point. Till there's an agreement, the conflict carries on. But because of the United States' stance and how they're behaving, the Europeans are panicking because, again, it's back to we're suffering from the Cold War PTSD. We think that if Russia's not defeated, then they're going to suddenly try and take all of Ukraine in a year or 6 months. Then they're going to go after Poland and the Baltic republics, etc., etc. Now, of course, this is not reality, but the question is if the United States effectively pulls the plug and says, well, we're not supporting Ukraine anymore, although obviously I put a YouTube clip out earlier, which now there's some question whether the United States is going to provide military aid on the basis of what Trump ill-advisedly came out with. But let's work on the basis that Europe goes, well, for the duration of this war, whatever it is, we're going to be the ones who's going to have to support Ukraine, which means we have to finance them. And we also have to provide weapons and equipment and everything else that country needs, because without the aid and the financial aid, the country collapsed because it's totally broke. It doesn't have any money whatsoever. So without handouts, the whole government, the whole system would collapse because no one would get paid, etc., etc. So the question is, Europe goes, we have to do this because someone has to fill the void. Because if we don't, then Russia wins the war. And what does that mean? And they're completely and utterly divorced from reality as to what that means anyway, because Russia's already won the war. So the first questions we have to ask ourselves is, what does it mean for the European NATO countries to take over the spending or the financial budgetary commitments to Ukraine? Well, there's a big problem. First off, Europe broke itself. Germany's in serious trouble, so is France, Italy, all the major countries, even more so than some of the old pigs countries in the south. But they don't have the financial capability to bankroll Ukraine. And they've already actually effectively, of course, given more money to Ukraine than the United States. And as Macron correctly had to point out, to Trump when they were sat there together. I'm sure Trump was thrilled about this being publicly dressed down by Macron of all people, but he made the point, look, we didn't give loans. These were grants. We're not expecting the money to be paid back, which Trump, of course, claimed the Europeans did or were going to do so to justify why the US should do so. But the point is they're not going to get any money back. They're already, though, panicking and going, well, we can't afford to do this, but we can't publicly admit it. So they wanted to get Ukraine to come up with some alternative deal for mineral rights in return for support. That shows how desperate Europe is, because rather like the United States, they can't afford to bankroll this war anymore. But equally, of course, they are sat there going, well, we have to bankroll it if the US doesn't. And then the other problem is they're then left with, well, there's this 300 billion euros sat frozen in our banks, which belongs to Russia. Well, maybe we'll just start spending that. Now, of course, they've been warned countless times that if they did that, it would be absolutely disastrous for the European Union countries, for their reputation, for trust. No one would want to do business with them anymore. You wouldn't want to park your capital, put it this way, in European banks. So the banking system would be in trouble. Their general economy would even be in more trouble. The financial system be in trouble. Who knows what it would do to the euro as a currency? And the list goes on. So fundamentally, it's not a policy they should entertain. But given they're that desperate, they may do something as idiotic as that to keep financing the war, because the argument is no one knows when the war will actually end, because we can have these discussions and it depends, and we'll do it in a subsequent podcast, what Russia's current thinking is. And is this agreement with the United States remotely going to adhere to any of Russia's requests in the end? If they don't, the war will carry on and on and on. And Europe will then get more and more desperate, and they'll basically absolutely destroy economically, financially, the whole region, because the vast bulk of those countries are in NATO. And then the consequence of doing this to those countries who aren't in NATO is going to be hugely detrimental as well, because if you start destroying the Eurozone and the Euro currency, it doesn't matter whether you're in NATO or not in NATO. So, or under this NATO splinter group, for want of a better word, that would exist in Europe as opposed to the United States. So that just deals with the first point of how does Europe, in a broad sense, handle the idea that they take this on board. And just one final point, Ken, before I hand it back to you, as it were, then the question is, where did they get their arms from? Because they don't have any. The Germans, military industrial company, have come out and gone, the cupboard's bare, there's nothing left. We don't have anything. They even have problems with a lack of resources to make weapons. They can't manufacture weapons anywhere near as quickly as the Russians do. So that's an admission they can't win the war. The other thing is or help Ukraine in any meaningful way. And for Duda to come out and say to Zelensky, look, you're just going to accept the fact the war's over. You're going to have to realize there's nothing. There's going to be an agreement. You're just going to have to live with it. Well, when push comes to comes to shove, then what's going to happen with respect to Europe's role in this? Now, clearly, and we'll come on to some statements regarding certain European NATO countries who are thinking somewhat differently about this. But that, I think, is the initial assessment of continuing the war and why Europe cannot do this. It's because you can't magically produce munitions, armaments, etc., to give to Ukraine. You can't. Well, you can print money, but what is it going to cost them? If it drags on another 6 months, the amount of the way they hemorrhage money, you could be talking 100 billion euros. maybe more. Who's going to finance it? No one can finance it. So that immediately just renders any idea of Europe taking on the mantle and going, well, the US is clearing off and doesn't want to help anymore. We're going to be in a position to support Ukraine is just ridiculous and frankly nonsensical.
One of the things I find interesting is you take a look at a couple things, and it's not surprising that Europe wants to take charge. Well, as much as they can, especially Germany as a remaining vassal state. We'll see how that goes. But Trump, ironically, thinks of everything as a business transaction. And when you listen to his hyperbole going out there, the outrageous statements he does, and then the behind the scenes thing, he always thinks of things as in negotiation, benefits, and profits. If you look at that, pulling out of Europe, pulling out of the EU, pulling out of NATO potentially is a monetary thing. And he can use the hyperbole of, well, we've supported Europe for all these years and they haven't given us anything. See, he looks at it from both sides. We're not getting any benefit from it, and we're being tied to the whims and desires of what Europe's going to do. And we may get dragged into a war if one of the Eastern European chihuahuas, starts something and Article 5 is pulled, and all of a sudden the U.S. now has to support that. The other thing is it was interesting when you take a look at the hyperbole that Trump does. Look at what the U.S. does instead. On the 3-year anniversary, Europe wanted to go to the UN and do this draft resolution, castigating Russia and supporting Ukraine, and the United States voted against it. And I think that was a wake-up call to much of Europe, who is suddenly realizing that they can't get away with the same machinations that they did before. You have to wonder, if Trump was in office back in the late 1990s, would NATO have gone into Yugoslavia? It all depends on, who's in charge in the U.S., whether NATO can get involved in anything to begin with. So with that being said, I think Europe is recognizing, and I think the U.S. is too, the U.S. cannot continue to fund and be the world police and support everybody in every little thing that they want, while in the meantime not getting any benefit from it. Because if you think about it, when we were over in Syria, well, we still have some bases in Syria, it was all about getting the oil. Now it's getting the minerals from Ukraine. It's always about profits and a benefit for the U.S. to get involved and do something under a Trump administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a point worth making with regards to this whole development as well is that in essence, Europe's move is about an internal political issue, because all the political capital says we can't walk away from Ukraine because we've brainwashed everyone as much as possible in Europe why this war has to continue. If we suddenly abandon Ukraine, like the Americans seem to be doing, then it's political suicide for us. So we have to keep supporting them, even if they really understand privately. And for Duda to make his comment to Zelensky proves they do know the war's over. But their fear is, well, if we abandon this, Russia will carry on the war and they'll march all the way to Lvov in the west and take the entire country, which, of course, they're never going to do. But the truth is, potentially, in theory, they could do exactly that. If the support from the West stops today, within a week or two, Russia could be, and I stress could be, but won't be in Lvov, because there'll be nothing between them and where they are now to stop that happening. So that's also factored into this thinking. And because of being political hostages to their own propaganda, and because of all this political capital, they're therefore now talking about effectively sacrificing what's left of Europe. Because let's face it, the Ukraine war's decimated Europe because of their stupidity about energy and the boomerang effect on sanctions, which we made the point the day the war started. If the West's serious about these sanctions, Europe will collapse. And of course, for people, it doesn't make any sense, but the writing was always on the wall from day one. And here we are, that's the case. So then we come on to the next phase, which is, let's assume the war ends in the sense, and Europe didn't commit the way they intended to because they didn't need to. And there's some amicable agreement. The war ends and whatever agreement's in place is in place. Then the question is, Europe's still petrified that Russia is going to try and invade the rest of Ukraine. So they're going to sit there and go, well, we have to have peacekeeping forces. And I stress peacekeeping forces. There isn't going to be any NATO forces sent in to continue the war with Ukraine. This comment's been going on for 3 years, and frankly, it's tiresome, tedious, and it's nonsense. But in a post-Ukraine war world, already the British, the French, and the Germans have gone, we're going to put peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. Now, here's the thing, nothing's been agreed to have peacekeeping forces. They're already thinking they're going to decide where those peacekeeping forces are, which is basically along the existing contact line, which doesn't really exist anyway, because it's so fragmented. But Russia's not going to give up territory it regards as being part of Russia. So already. But the other point is they've made it categorically made the statement there is to be no NATO forces as peacekeeping forces inside Ukraine. They can be under the umbrella of the EU. They can claim to be independent nations, but if they're NATO members, it's not happening. So if they insist on this, this will be a deal breaker. The war will not end because Russia's only going to agree to peacekeepers who are non-NATO countries. So what happens if they still are stubborn and refuse to acknowledge that and then try to move into those countries, into Ukraine? What's the first thing that's going to happen? Russia's going to go, you've broken the agreement. The war commences again. And then what happens? And they're only going to be small numbers of peacekeeping forces. They're going to be trying to get out of the country as fast as they can because they know the war's back on. And the Americans are going to go, no security guarantees for you lot. You've made the decision. They've already said this. There's no Article 5. You're on your own. So they also have to live with the consequences of that. And also, again, it's more expenditure. What else are they going to be forced to, in terms of military expenditure, financial expenditure to support all this? Because nothing's free in the West. Everything costs way too much. So that's the next point of it. What role does these NATO countries play in an agreement inside Ukraine? Well, apparently, as far as Russia's concerned, nothing. What other roles might they have to play? And what is in this case, the British, the French, and the Germans prepared to accept? Because they might just be so idiotic. They're going to go, no, we're not accepting this. And then they're putting themselves at direct risk, and Russia's going to, the US will say, you're on your own. No Article 5. If you start fighting with Russia's troops, well, good luck, as you're going to be the ones at war with them, not us. We don't care. We'll tell the Russians, nothing to do with us. Remember, we're not peacekeeping forces there. So this is not our war anymore. We've walked away because America always wants to walk away from very inconvenient battles, wars, anything that makes them look bad. So in that sense, again, this is just not reality. They're not engaging their brains and thinking what they're actually doing.
I think as well, you got to take a look at the fact that not every European nation is in lockstep with each other. The EU might. We already know that crew, what their thoughts on Russia, the conflict is, etc. But take a look at what Starmer is doing. In the end, unfortunately, unless there is a change of government, elections, abdication or whatever, even before the war, the conflict, and the U.S. got involved with the overthrow, the coup, and all that. That part of Ukraine has always been had a tinge of corruption through it, and you go back to things like the what was it the missile strikes on the uh, Crimean Bridge that had tentacles from UK in it, working with the Ukrainians. So even after a ceasefire slash peace agreement or end of the conflict is done, if there are still the elements within Ukraine, then there are going to be European countries who are going to use them for covert things rather than an outward, an overt proxy. If the Europeans as a whole are not in agreement, and we see this because the new elections in Germany, well, meet the old boss, same as the old boss, going to keep the things going. We don't know what's going to happen in France. We don't know if reform is going to take over in England. We don't know these things yet. But currently, the leadership in Europe is half are saying one thing and half really want to get the heck out of Dodge. And I think that's going to be a big question, and possibly why Lavrov came out and said, you know what, we're just going to keep going. We're going to ignore you until we accomplish all the things that we intend to with this SMO.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a final point is, because all these European nations and NATO are in total disarray, and Trump keeps going to spend 5% of GDP. They can't do that. It's impossible. They're now still going, we must spend more on defense spending. We've never been under more serious threat than ever. Almost like worse than the Cold War era, because they think Russia's going to, apparently Russia's always going to lose the war, but then they're going to take the whole of Europe. So, go figure the stupidity and contradiction in those statements. But they're now talking also about massively increasing defense spending. Like the UK, we're going to raise it to 2.5% of GDP, but not for 2 years. So perhaps that will never happen. That's just more hyperbole. But the problem is they can't afford to do this. They're all bankrupt, and defense spending for what? As I made the point on X, what are you increasing defense spending for? For a ground war that will never happen? Because even though people like to think a ground war is going to happen, what, between all nuclear powers? Absolutely no chance, because the war will always end up degenerating into a nuclear war, and it'll happen almost immediately because both sides will be going, well, they've got nuclear weapons, they might use them, right, use them. So there's going to be no ground war and cyber attacks and attacks in cities and destabilizing countries like they think Russia's going to do. This is all just, academic nonsense. There's no reality to it. It will be a nuclear war, and the Western countries be incinerated in 5 to 10 minutes, and that's the end. No more war, all over. You're being totally annihilated. And they need to understand this. So this justification for defense spending is trying to get the Starmers and all these other countries. So people will always rally around them because they're brainwashed that Russia's the evil enemy who wants to invade, and it's worse than ever. And you're already seeing this huge shift in support for people like Starmer, who a week or two ago was the most hated leader in the whole of Europe. So this shows how easy it is to condition people. But again, they can't afford to do this. It's meaningless, and because the argument's going to be, hopefully, well, you've always got money to fight wars, or to tell us about fictional enemies who are going to come and attack us, but it's always austerity when it comes to things that countries need by the very definition of their existence. And people in the West need to understand and start waking up to this reality, which is going to be very difficult because they're so conditioned to believe nonsense. But again, this is another thing. If Europe tries to do this, they're going to have to take control. They're going to have to increase defense spending to a level they can't afford to do so, because they have to then be seen to be doing the right things. So, and of course, if the Americans pull out, well, what will they take with them? Everything. Their military personnel, their forces, their bases, their nuclear weapons. So this is the other problem they've got. As much as they're furious with the US, they don't want the US to leave. But so there's all these conflicting ideas going on in their minds, and really, they don't. They just again flapping their gums, but trying to look like they're being tough on Russia, but deep down they know they can't afford to do this. But equally, if they don't do it, it's political suicide. So talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place. This is the most obvious example of this probably in decades.
And in the end, there's no problem with European nations wanting to ensure their own defense. But the problem in the end is that as long as NATO is alive, it's an
Hello, Ken? Hello?
albatross. Where did I get cut off?
You got cut off at the point when you just start. Well, what were you saying? Well, you obviously came back.
NATO?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You got cut off at the point where you were saying you just started speaking again. So maybe just start from the beginning.
Okay. Starting in. Yeah, I think in the end, when you take a look at it, there's nothing wrong with Europe creating its own defense. That's a given. But NATO is an albatross hanging over the heads of Europe and maybe even the rest of the world, tied to the Cold War that is no longer a thing. And until NATO, in my opinion, goes by the wayside and Europe changes their mentality and their thought process regarding defense, the inevitability is that there will always be this push, and I equate it to the accumulation of modern weapons leading up to World War I. All these nations had an arms race with machine guns and artillery and this and that. If you have weapons, there usually has to be a need to use them. And NATO is the same way. As long as NATO is there with this function, they're going to want to expand, whether it's to Southeast Asia, which has been some of the talk, or the need to get involved in conflicts that have nothing to do with NATO. This is always going to remain over the heads of Europe until they divest themselves and start looking at the 21st century viewpoint of the world, the multipolar world, rather than still from the eyes and lens of the Cold War. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion and for your great insight.
Yes, and likewise.
And for everybody here at the Sirius Report Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.